Hello, everyone. My name is Kennetta Hammond Perry, and I am the director of the Stephen Lawrence Research Center at De Montfort University. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Natalie Darko, who's an associate professor of research in the center. And we are very excited to be a part of the Festival of Teaching and to share a little bit about some of the research that we're doing related to looking at the impact of COVID-19 on teaching, learning, and mental well-being here in Leicester. So I just wanted to have you introduce yourself or say hello, Natalie, before we get started.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Yes, we're going to talk about the project that we're working on and hopefully give you an insight to what we're doing, and also perhaps ask some questions about what you think should happen next in relation to the study, but also perhaps how DMU can work collaboratively to try and address the effects of COVID-19, particularly on young people in schools. So moving swiftly on.
Yeah, so essentially, this project and sort of trying to look at the impact of COVID-19 came out of work that we're doing as part of work that's funded through DMU Local Plus, which is a collaborative sort of research set of research projects that are being undertaken between the university and the Leicester City Council. And part of the work of those projects is to think about different ways that the research expertise and the resources within the university can be leveraged to solve or to address issues in real time that are relevant to the Leicester community, and also to think about ways that we can do that in partnership with the local authorities. So again, this is one of a number of projects that's funded, partially funded by that pool through that DMU Local Plus funding. And so part of our project really began in the context of trying to think about issues around inequalities in education, but also thinking about how COVID-19 was going to shape those pre-existing inequalities within education. And just to kind of give you a bit of context, if we just look more generally pre-COVID in terms of education and questions around inequities in education, there are a number of different areas where we could, track the ways that we're seeing different kinds of outcomes or different kinds of experiences within education that produce certain kinds of inequities. And just to kind of give you a sense that, what we're looking at in terms of the impact of COVID-19 always has to be taken within the context of what was happening before. I just want to kind of highlight, if we look at some of the data that came out of the UK race disparity audit in 2017, and this was really a massive government-sponsored survey where they were looking at a number of different arenas where the government was trying to sort of pay attention to disparities that were existing, particularly along the lines of race and ethnicity, or that were tracking along the lines of race and ethnicity. And education was just one of those arenas, alongside areas like the criminal justice system, health outcomes, outcomes in terms of the labor market. And so if we look at some of that data from the 2017 race disparity audit, we can see that in terms of academic outcomes in relation to students in ages 11 through 16, so in secondary education, we could see that data showed us a number of disparities in terms of academic outcomes or attainment levels or achievement levels that tracked along lines of race and ethnicity, also in gender, and also in terms of free school meals, which is also oftentimes a marker of sort of a metric to kind of understand social deprivation, or sort of questions around socioeconomic status. And so some of that data kind of, if we were looking again pre-COVID within the context of academic outcomes and education, in terms of the ethnicity data, some of that report sort of showed us that some of the groups who were seeing some of the highest gaps in terms of academic outcomes, in terms of progress, but also in terms of their actual levels of academic progress, we saw some of the highest rates of underachievement or underattainment or lower academic outcomes amongst Black Caribbean students, mixed race, white and Black Caribbean students, and then in a kind of in the categories of Gypsy and Roma and Irish traveler. And then these, again, I should note that these are census categories, and oftentimes that's one of the big issues when you're looking at race and ethnicity data. The classifications can be quite tricky and oftentimes inconsistent. But in that larger data pool, we saw that these were the groups that were oftentimes disproportionately negatively affected in terms of educational outcomes when it came to issues around attainment or academic achievement. Also, some of the other data that came out of that report showed that when it came to gender across every ethnic or racial classification, girls tended to outperform their male peers. And then also across race and ethnic categories, we found that students who were eligible for free school meals were also in categories of students, again, and this is across all race and ethnic categories, that typically made less progress in terms of positive academic outcomes and levels of attainment that were oftentimes are captured in something known as a P8 score, or a score that's kind of indicating where schools in the aggregate are performing in terms of levels of academic attainment at that kind of pre-GCSE level. So this kind of, data kind of gave us a picture of, a really kind of up close picture of where we were in terms of just the broader landscape of inequalities that existed in UK education at the secondary level. And again, we're looking at this data from the 2017 report, but that has to be mapped against, again, historic inequalities that existed in education. But this gives us a kind of really recent snapshot of that's been taken on the national scale. So those were some of the things that we were trying to sort of, attend at, sort of thinking about in the context of this project developing, is if we were already dealing with a landscape in education that was already producing inequities, what was that going to mean within the context of the impact of COVID-19? And so that's sort of where some of the genesis of this project began. And part of what we wanted to do with this study is to kind of think about, what that meant in terms of Leicester and how those dynamics played out in Leicester. In terms of some of the data that exist in Leicester, the City Council did do a scrutiny report in 2019. And what that report did was it found or sort of tried to sort of think about underachievement, particularly amongst groups of students where we were seeing the highest levels of underachievement. And in the context of Leicester, the way that the City Council sort of looked at that report, they used the categories of the highest rates of underattainment were found amongst Black Caribbean students, and in a category known as white British working class students in Leicester City. And again, I have that in quotes there because, again, these categories, these racial and ethnic and even socioeconomic classifications are oftentimes very slippery and inconsistent. And there are ways in which some of the information that we were working with in terms of the data that was being collected locally didn't quite always align to the categories in the national data around some of these inequities. So again, we're trying to sort of think about some of these categories, which makes it challenging sometimes to kind of track the ways that these inequalities are existing. Some of the other interesting data that's come out from some of the work that the local authority has been tracking over the last few years also relates to issues around inequities in terms of the provision of access to mental health and social care, particularly for young men who were classified as either Black or Black British, coming from Black British ethnic backgrounds in Leicester. So again, not only we were sort of seeing, these inequities in terms of achievement or in terms of educational outcomes, but also in this provision of health and well-being resources. mapped onto that as well, in terms of the view from Leicester, are these larger questions that were brought out in some of these reports about the impact of austerity and the ways in which the kind of defunding of social services and defunding of interventions that might have been targeted to certain kinds of groups who had been underserved in the community, the impact of that also was something that was highlighted, that was exacerbating some of these inequities that we were seeing in education and issues around mental well-being and provision of social care. One of the things that's really interesting, though, in terms of from our perspective about studying Leicester or thinking about these bigger questions that are affecting communities all across the country, but also really internationally within the context of COVID-19, is that demographically, Leicester is a really interesting place to think with and to think from, because of the racial and ethnic demography of the city. It's a city that does have a majority non-white population. And so when we're trying to sort of understand some of these inequities that are oftentimes disproportionately experienced by racially minoritized groups, Leicester offers a really interesting place to ask some of these questions and to collect data that would oftentimes be relevant in terms of local conversations, but also in terms of national conversations, in terms of tracking some of these disparities and the experiences around these disparities that the race disparity audit of 2017 already kind of gave us another snapshot into. I think the final thing that I think is important about asking some of these questions about the impact of COVID-19 in the context of Leicester is because Leicester was a place where we saw, or we continue to see, a period of extended lockdown. I know as of tomorrow, I think we'll be sort of looking at, a year on from the first national lockdown. But Leicester had a different trajectory than most of the country because of the ways in which COVID-19 impacted the city and its surrounding areas. And so there was a period where Leicester was in extended lockdown or in different tiers, which prompted different kinds of lockdown arrangements that were quite different from other parts of the country, particularly if you think about the ways in which the first national lockdown transition began to happen. Leicester was one of the places in the country that was highlighted for needing to have that extended lockdown that moved into the early part of the summer. So again, the dynamics of Leicester provide a really interesting place to think with about some of these issues and thinking about them in relation to education. So, part of what we're trying to do with this study again is to try to think about, what are, some of these dynamics that have shaped how COVID has impacted education, particularly at the secondary level. And these are just some of the obvious things that many people will be aware of or will have experienced firsthand. Is obviously the school closures, and again we're sort of 1 year on from that. Some of the other things that we're trying to be attendant to in terms of trying to understand this impact in Leicester is the disparities in the remote learning provision, and even early on in terms of some of the work that we're seeing, that there's a big difference in what remote learning provision looks like in terms of the content provided, but also the level of interaction, and also, of course, access. And again, a lot of those access issues have been highlighted by extreme digital technology divides that were also exacerbated and sort of made much more legible within the context of COVID-19. We also are, trying to think about, issues around how the idea that schools are closed has also created a context where students have had less social interactions. And then also, of course, adjusting to the home learning provision and the school closures means that there are these shifting home dynamics about education, but also about all sorts of working conditions. Homes are operating very differently for all sorts of reasons within the context of COVID-19, not only because of the shifting school provisions, but also the different ways of working that many of us have had to adjust to. So all of that is within in the context of thinking about impacts on education and thinking about the different ways that families are able to support or not, or be constrained in the ways that they're able to provide certain kinds of support for the transition to remote learning. And again, against the backdrop of all of this is sort of paying attention to the disparate impacts of COVID-19 in racially minoritized communities. And I think probably the last point that we're all still grappling with is that even as we're sort of, on a particular trajectory towards trying to finding light at the end of the tunnel in the context of vaccines and different treatments being developed, there's still a lot of uncertainty around, what this impact will be and what next steps should look like and what plans can look like and what that educational provision could look like. So it's within that context that we are raising some questions around this within this pilot study that's funded through DMU Local Plus. And I'm going to turn to Natalie now to kind of talk through where we are with the project and some of the things that we are up to in terms of the stage of the development of the project right now.
Thank you, Kanetta. So what I'm going to talk about now is a bit about the project and where we are basically, and just to give you an insight into what we're doing, but also to perhaps ask you some questions about what do you think should happen next really, and what do you think schools should do, and what do you think perhaps the government should do to support us, but also what can we do collaboratively as a university. So the question that, building on all the background research, the kind of pilot work or background research that we've done, talking to parents, the council, etc., young people in particular, is we wanted then to ask how have secondary students in years 10 and 11, parents and teachers, experienced the impact of COVID-19 in Leicester City, but with a focus on teaching, learning, and particularly mental well-being. So the objectives that we devised and that have informed our research are to look at certain key areas. So those objectives are to examine the responses of schools to the pandemic, where COVID has impacted in relation to teaching, learning, and mental well-being, but to get an understanding from the perspectives of teachers and secondary students. And I think one of the things that's highlighted across existing research, not only in health and mental well-being, but also across the disciplines, is that in particular, young people are being impacted in different ways, and mental well-being is important and it's coming to the fore. So we wanted to understand the experiences of the schools themselves from the teaching perspective, but also the students and also parents. So with that in mind, we're doing qualitative research. We're trying to build a qualitative evidence base that explores how parents and teachers have experienced the preventative measures. That's the closures and obviously now the opening, but also there's disruptions and modifications and the impact this has had on teaching and learning. The aim of doing the study, and most importantly, is to work with the local authority in particular to identify best practices. So those best practices as identified by teachers, parents and students, but to perhaps look at those best practices to how we can move forward, look at the effects of the interruptions and the modifications in schools, but also what we can do more to address the impact on mental well-being for students. And hopefully the outcome, in which we're working towards with the local authority in particular, is to develop recommendations. But those recommendations are to be taken in collaboration with those wider stakeholders. So not only the local authority, the community members, the students involved in particular, to try and address the effects of COVID-19 on learning, teaching and mental well-being. So they're the central objectives of the study. So what I'll do now is talk a little bit about what we've done so far and also some of the pilot work. So if we move to the next slide. So on this slide, we've basically trying to give you an overview of what we've done, but also to show you one of the posters that we've used for recruitment. So at the moment, we've invited schools to take part in the research. And one of the ways of doing that is to send a letter of invite, but also to send an easy read infographic so that tells the participants or those who may be interested what the study's about, what we've learned so far and what we will do in the research, and also to ensure that how we will address the ethics within that, but also in a way we want to show the benefits of what what the research could do for the future. So we've got different types of methods that we've used. We've got a survey in particular that will go across 3 Leicester City schools, which examines mental well-being. So particular measures have been included that focuses on year 10 and 11 students to ask them about their mental well-being at this time, and also to give them an opportunity to express their concerns. But one of the ways in which we've decided to do that is to use video logs or vlogs, or also an audio log. So students will have an option within the survey to upload a video log that tells them it allows them to express their personal experiences of the school closures and mental well-being, and also recommendations. But the reason that we've decided to use the vlogs, and in particular in this study, is that there's lots of research that recognises, importantly at this time period, that videos in particular are a way of expressing yourself, particularly amongst young people, whether that's through TikTok or other different mechanisms. The opportunity to express yourself with a vlog is important. But most importantly, research tells us that for minority groups in particular, or BME groups, vlogs are used as a medium of expression. I won't say safe space, but it's an alternative means of expression to get their voices heard that perhaps are unheard in other research methods. Or also that notion that, for example, the words that I don't like are being hard to reach in particular, but the notion that the vlog can give them an alternative means of expression. So there's an option, and it's part of the survey. They can upload the vlog, but also if they don't want to do that, they can use an audio recording. So it gives that option to express their concerns. So that's free and open, or they can basically answer some set questions. We also have semi-structured interviews as well. So the interviews allow parents and carers to express their concerns or any thoughts about their experiences, but with a focus on teaching, learning, and mental well-being. So moving forward as part of this, or where we are now, is that we've done some pilot work already that has shown us some key findings. And in a way, if we look at that thematically, the key findings from that pilot work are that there are definitely differences in how virtual provision has been delivered across schools. So there are differences in the sense that maybe face-to-face teaching is available, and in other schools that's not the case, and it may be electronic email systems and delivery of worksheets. But also we found that in the pilot work already that there's a focus on lack of social interaction for young people and missing that social interaction. So Kanetta's point earlier was that Leicester's been in this extended period of lockdown. I think that's important to recognise, because in a way those young people have experienced an extended period of lack of social interaction, not only in school but also in the wider outside world with their peers, where they might be able to meet up and access other people. So having that extended period has got to have some kind of impact on young people within Leicester in particular. Also, there's parent vulnerability. And as a parent myself with 2 children, one in secondary, one in primary, that notion that I thought I knew it all, but now I don't, trying to help them with the schooling, I think that's come out in the pilot work already. You think you're an expert, but I think that vulnerability is definitely coming out in parents. So this is where we are with the methods, and the pilot works has indicated some things that we know already, but also some interesting points that we're seeing in the literature, but I think should help schools and also help local authorities and all of us who need recommendations on how to protect children in this current pandemic. So moving on, I'm going to just talk briefly about some of the interventions, or what next really. So we want to do this study, but what do we already know about particular interventions or programs that are running that are available to address mental well-being for young people in schools? So at the moment, there's already a program that's been commissioned by the Department of Education, which is called Wellbeing for Education Return. So it's ending in March 2021, or it's supposed to be, as we're aware, and it's being supported by different organisations. And the focus is allowing schools to utilise a budget, but also deliver resources and programmes that will help schools and students respond to the impact of the pandemic. The aim of the scheme was to allow every school and college access to the programme. But as we've seen already, and is highlighted in literature and different public platforms, is that the rollout has been delayed. And also schools have used the budget in their own ways to deliver programs that works for them within their schools. At the moment, there's also some research that's examining the impact of this program. So notably, there's a randomized controlled trial which looks at the approaches to wellbeing and mental health that's been taken up in the schools. And it's looking at the impact of those programs on young people. But their programs themselves are about addressing or raising awareness of mental health, the risks, and what to do. And some schools have taken them up, and also some schools are doing programs of their own. But the important point to recognise is that there are different types of programs being available. The evaluation of those programs and what next is really important. But also what's important is trying to understand, what do we do next? What should we do? And also perhaps asking questions to yourself as the audience, what could we do to look at this in more depth? And if we move to the next slide, we can perhaps talk about that in more depth. So the next slide throws the question out to you, basically. It's been highlighted in the news recently, which has been raised by many, but now action's being taken, that it's been recognised that collectively pupils in England have lost 840 million days of in-person schooling, which equals about 19 weeks for each child, which is a significant amount of time. But also within that, inequalities that exist already have been heightened for young people. So the new Children's Commissioner announced last week that they want to rebuild childhood. They want to look at the effects of the disruptions on young people from COVID-19. So what we wanted to do today is try and ask you what you think the next steps should be for addressing the negative effects of COVID-19 on the school closures and also the disruptions. But also, what could we do at De Montfort in particular? What could we do collectively, perhaps through our research, our strategies, or working together to address the issues of the potential negative effects of COVID-19 on education in Leicester secondary schools? So how could we address some of those points that Canetta raised, that recognises the digital divide in particular, that the limited access to free school meals, the limited access to laptops, and also perhaps maybe questions about the differences in the digital provision and that notion of what is digital provision and the virtual provision for young people. So we'd like to throw it out to yourselves, and hopefully you can have a discussion about what you think the next steps are and what are your thoughts on the school closures and the disruptions to young people. So feel free at any point to ask us any questions. And until then, I'm sure Canetta and I have lots of questions that we have and suggestions on what we think already. But if anyone would like to ask any questions, please feel free. I mean, Canetta, what are your thoughts at the moment? What do you think we should do, or even De Montfort should do collectively to address this, more than what we're doing in the research itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I think even the work that projects like DMU Local Plus do are trying to highlight the fact that, you know, when we're dealing with sort of pressing social issues, that universities have this role to play. I think one of the things that I think is really important in terms of what this project highlights for me is that we cannot necessarily think about interventions that are just about solving a problem that we think is constrained to COVID-19, but that we actually need to be thinking about interventions that allow us to deal with those pre-existing inequities in education. So we want to be responsive to the impact of COVID-19, but I think at the same time, we want to think about ways in which, you know, we look towards solutions and look towards interventions that can also open up, you know, addressing those previous disparities that existed. And I was wondering, actually, Natalie, if you wanted to say a bit more about, I mean, I think one of the things that's important about why we added mental well-being in terms of trying to look at the impact on teaching and learning was because, you know, the data is showing us that when students, you know, have really strong social and emotional competencies, and when their mental well-being is well taken care of, or, you know, or they're doing well in that regard, there is a higher correlation between, you know, higher academic outcomes, and those kind of positive correlations in terms of educational achievement and educational success. So I think, you know, there's a way in which, you know, there's been a lot that's been upset around mental health and well-being within the context of the pandemic. But there are ways in which perhaps some of the interventions that we might look to in response to that might also be designed to address some of those things that were there before COVID-19. One of the things though, Natalie, while we're waiting for perhaps some comments or questions from the audience, I don't know if you wanted to say a bit more about the lack of research that's looking specifically at Black and minority ethnic students in terms of research that's been done, preliminary research that's been happening really over the last year, trying to pay attention to the impact of COVID-19 on education, and just sort of where some of the research is what we're trying to do in that regard, and sort of what the lay of the land is in terms of questions around Black and minority ethnic students.
Yeah, so it was a great opportunity to join the project, and one of the things I did when I came in to say that we definitely need to look at mental well-being, but we also definitely need to recognise that the differences in the impact of the school closures to minority groups. So there are a number of studies, different studies within health and across disciplines, that have looked at the impact of COVID-19 on young people, and most of those studies have importantly highlighted the differences in impact on BME groups in particular. But most importantly, one of the struggles they have is the access to, not access, but the sample size of BME students within those studies. So they're large studies and give us lots of information, but the number of students within that studies that are for ethnic minority groups is always small. But yet there's data that also tells us, the data that does exist does tell us that there's significant differences between white students and minority students, so that we need more research in that area. So it's really important that we try and do more research that perhaps tries to understand why there are differences in mental well-being and mental health for minority groups, but also that gives us perhaps a bit more of that qualitative understanding, so that then if the future is to develop interventions or programs or work collaboratively with young people to develop programs or activities, we need to understand how those inequalities have affected those different ethnic minority groups, rather than looking at that as a broader scale. And I think it's important that we do more research to try and understand that. I think we have some questions in the chat.
Yeah,
Maybe.
I
Oh, here we
noticed.
go.
Yeah. S. Palmer has highlighted the fact that there are a lot of strands to cover, and that there's a danger of kind of spreading too thin to even understanding correlations and sort of what's happening there, and asking this question about, do you select a few things to focus on with the notion of trying to get kind of that pilot or that seed going with, and then trying to attract more resources, or how do we approach this topic? And I can just, one of the things that's interesting to me is that we've raised this question about the role of the university, and I do think that's where the university is an interesting place to be a part of these conversations, because we do have a number of, if we think about those areas that we listed on the previous slide, addressing issues around the digital divide, education, even issues around free school meals. It's a conversation that hopefully these types of projects, that there's room for a number of different entities across the university to be involved in. So if you think about, what's the university's role in terms of addressing issues around digital technologies, and we have these really great departments at DMU that deal with issues around technology, and how do we think about access to those kinds of resources, and then thinking about how the university can play a role to join those up with questions in education, and then questions within health. And I think that's kind of how we're beginning to think within our team. How can we bring together, even as we look to try to scale up this project, how can we bring together expertise across a number of different fields to kind of tackle some of the multiple strands that may come up? But I do think one of the things that we're trying to do right now is literally trying to just kind of collect the data and trying to understand what the experiences are in this context, so that we can really build responses around the kind of lived experience of navigating the dynamics of COVID-19. I'm not sure if Natalie, if you wanted to add anything there.
Yeah, and I think so within the study itself, we've tried to keep it small because we recognise it's a small study. So there's only a small number of interviews, for example, and a small um, recruitment in a way. So that's important. But also, I think moving forward, we've already developed our next steps, and our research funding applications to extend the study have already been submitted, and different to look at different areas. So it's just in a way a small scale study to see what data we can get, and but also to raise awareness and hopefully encourage lots of other people out there to do more research to give us that knowledge database that we don't have. So we're trying to do as much as we can and achieve a lot. And also, I've done a lot of research, and I think there's always this assumption that you need a massive amount of money to achieve, to collect data, and also that you need a significant amount of time to just get some rich information. When just even one researcher can get some great rich data that gives us insights to people's lived experiences of the pandemic. And I think it's really important that we get more voices heard, particularly from BME students and parents, and also teachers' perspectives at this time. So I think there's another question as well. So do you have any data or knowledge on the other educational levels, primary or HE? And you're just, S. Palmer's just interested in what the larger picture looks like. I can go if you want. Is that okay, Ganessa? Yeah, just checking. I don't want to talk over.
No, 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 no.
So
Go right ahead.
yeah, there's lots of there is more and more data coming out, and as you do the trawl of the different literature, there's definitely more data, particularly at HE level, about differences between students and the inequalities experienced. But there's also lots on primary data, and also there are different wellbeing programs that have looked at the impact on primary school children as well. So that program that I mentioned in particular is also looking at primary school children, and also the evaluations are starting of the effect on primary school children. So there's definitely other studies and data, and feel free to email me if you want any more information or references. I didn't know if you wanted to add any more, Canetta.
No, I think to your point, I think I was struck, like I said, in terms of some of the literature that we've come across thus far, thinking about just general literature that's trying to think about issues around the connections between academic outcomes and mental health and well-being. We've actually found that, more of that, there needs to be more of that happening, particularly in the UK anyway. But even when that data is existing, is actually much more concentrated at the primary levels than the secondary education levels, which for us, was a real gap that we were trying to think about in terms of paying attention to that. I think one of the things that we haven't put on the table, which I think is really interesting, we're working with the Leicester City Council and thinking about the local authority. But one of the dynamics that I think, even in our consultation with the assistant mayor, Ellie Kelvin, and Sue Welford, who is the director of teaching and learning within the city council, one of the dynamics that is, I think, really important to note is that the ways in which increasing numbers of students don't attend schools that are supported by the local authority. They're within academies. And so even that process of, academizing schools comes from, where a school has been designated as underperforming over a period of time. And then that academization progress process is offered as a kind of solution to address a kind of context in which low attainment or underperformance has happened within a larger school environment. And so I think that's been one of the things that's been really interesting to think about, and one of the dynamics that I think we would have to sort of attend to when we're thinking about who are the stakeholders, because even beyond the city council, which has an interest really in all students that would be within the confines of spaces that the local authority has authority authority. So it's not that they don't have any kind of duty or responsibility to think about students within the city, but it is interesting to think about the role that they are actually playing in terms of individual schools. And this isn't just a Leicester issue; it's a national issue in terms of the role that local authorities actually have to play as authorities within the context of the schooling environments. And that's been one of the things that's been a kind of eye-opening dynamic to think about when you're thinking about trying to address issues around educational inequalities more broadly, not just within the context of COVID-19. Don't know if there are any other questions that have come up. And I don't know, Natalie, if you wanted to say anything more about the role of universities within this conversation at all. If there's a different take that you might want to offer about the place of universities in some of these conversations.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognise that what we could do locally. I think it would be great if we could create some kind of sandpit event for us to look at, as Palmer has said, that maybe that we could come together to collaborate to do more. Maybe there are other strands that we could do collaboratively as a sandpit event to perhaps look at a collaborative research project and application that will perhaps address the negative effects within this region. I think that would be really useful, and I think it would definitely take the research forward on the next steps. But I think what's important, as the Child Commissioner for England tried to do, or is going to do, is this notion of the big Ask survey that's going to be launched after Easter. So within this notion of rebuilding childhood, that this big Ask survey is in a way trying to do the similar thing that we've identified in this study, find out the effects on young people in schools, but also alternative curriculum and the alternative curriculum providers. So that survey is going to roll out through Oak National Academy, and which is a free platform that you can access for your children to access live teaching, recorded teaching lessons and the curriculum activities. So this survey is going to run out, and the aim is to look at the impact on mental health as well, and then to develop strategies. So I think it's important to consider how could we as a university input into pieces of research that are going to come out, such as the Big Ask survey, and what things should they be asking in that survey beyond our particular project. I think DMU has a great collaborative network that we could utilize and work together to look at that in more detail. But it would be interesting to see what the findings are. I think are important. But in terms of HE, I think the universities themselves are completing studies, and I know more researchers are looking at that, particularly in the notion of decolonising practice and how we address mental well-being and research within HEs. I think there's more research coming, none of which I have to reference at this point, but I think I'll be interested to see what happens in the next year. And also, I think it's important in terms of maybe a question to you, Kanetta. What do you think is going to be next? Do you think we're going to, so from my experiences, children in schools at the moment are closing half years and partial years because of COVID cases. What's the next stage? And if we do have half school closures or the school closes again, what do you think the next step should be for us as researchers, but also perhaps future projects?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things for me is that I think what COVID-19 has done in so many different domains is opened up the necessity for us to ask about what education should look like more generally moving forward outside of the context of COVID-19. It's allowed, forced us to kind of open ourselves up to different kinds of possibilities for what teaching and learning and its delivery can look like, which, aren't all negative. Like there are ways in which I think there are a lot of open questions about whether, there are some going to be, if you think about particularly issues around race in education and race and racism in education, and you can think about certain kids who might have found, the context of a kind of traditional school environment, something that was a place of harm. What does it mean to think about ways in which schools in the future are kind of opening themselves up at the secondary level. I think in HE, we are beginning to kind of think about what hybrid models look like in terms of delivery of education and creating different kinds of educational experiences using virtual platforms. But, are there ways in which other kinds of inequities in education might be remedied by the different ways that education at the secondary level has had to make adjustments within the context of COVID-19? So I think I think we're at a moment that is creating different kinds of reckonings, which are opening up different kinds of possibilities. We're reckoning with, in different ways, the existing inequalities that were there, but it also opens up possibilities for thinking about new ways forward that have been birthed within the context of trying to adjust to COVID-19, which could be interesting. I'm seeing another question in the chat as well from Camille London Mayo about could DMU do a mapping of the mentoring initiatives for African heritage children and young people in the city? And I think, again, that is something that yeah, I think it is needed. I think one of the things from thus far from some of the data that we've come across is that that obviously there's a lot of unevenness in terms of provisions, particularly around mentoring. And one of the things that scrutiny report highlighted was the need for mentoring as an intervention to think about how we address issues around underachievement. And I do think that is a kind of very concrete role that the university could play in terms of the ways that we engage within the city. But I think the question is about mapping what's there, but then, doing that as a preliminary exercise to think about, what can come next and how the university can be responsive to those gaps. And I do think that could be an agenda in terms of how we think about our engagement with the city. And that kind of marries up to Natalie's point as well about that these issues around education aren't happening in a silo. It's not a conversation about just the primary or the secondary and then HE, that perhaps we need to be thinking much more as a whole kind of systems approach to how we think about some of these interventions, so that it's not just the university responding to an issue that's external to the university, but the university also, finding ways to participate in a bigger conversation that it is also implicated in around educational inequalities. But I do think that could definitely be an agenda that could be taken up as part of some of the collaborative work that's happening within the DMU local agenda, is to try to think about, what are those mentoring initiatives that are present within the city. But I don't know if Natalie, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely important, as I highlighted with the current program, that there's inconsistencies in how it's been delivered, and actually knowledge in schools themselves of what of those programs and initiatives available. I think definitely you need a mapping exercise. I think the challenge you have, and I hope that there's mentoring initiatives for African heritage children, but from what we know already in the current research and just some of the pilot data, that there isn't much going on, and particularly for African heritage children. So I think maybe nationally, I think you would identify some of those mentoring initiatives, but it'd be interesting to see where, if they are happening across the city, and to look at those. But then the follow-up is an evaluation, perhaps, but also not also an evaluation, but essentially our aim in a way is to get the voices of young people heard, to co-produce and collaborate initiatives and mentoring programs that work for them and are relevant, culturally appropriate, relevant and understood by different ethnic minority groups, and the differences between those ethnic minority groups. It may be that the mapping exercise might show mentoring schemes and programs that are for across BME groups potentially, or across all pupils, as opposed to perhaps more targeted ones, but then also come with their problems. But I think it'll be interesting to see. But I definitely think that would be worth exploring and finding out from young people, not only from teachers of what they are, but also from young people's perspectives. I think that's important. Okay.
Yeah, I don't see any additional questions in the chat. I just wanted to just highlight to everyone. First of all, thank everyone who has attended and logged into our session, and just remind everyone that we are, this is a pilot study for us. It's a set of questions that we're hoping to open up as part of the Stephen Lawrence Research Center's larger agenda to really be engaged in educational initiatives and activities and enhancing the context of education, a socially just educational experience in Leicester, and this is sort of part of that larger work, and it's an opportunity for us to open up some of those questions. I just sort of say as well. Please feel free to visit our website where you can find us online. I think it's this Stephen SLRC at dmu.ac.uk. And one of the other things that I want to draw everyone's attention to is that the SLRC over the last year, in the context of COVID-19, has created an online digital repository called the COVID Files, which is a repository that's tried to really track some of the conversation about particularly racial and ethnic disparities that have been created within the context of COVID-19. And that's a repository that we've been updating regularly with new research, reports that have come out from government agencies and different kinds of organizations that are doing research around the impact of COVID-19. And so I just want to draw everyone's attention to that. If you just Google the COVID Files, you would easily find that repository and resource there. And it's meant to be an information resource, but also a resource that can allow us to learn and to teach about the ongoing impacts of COVID-19 that we're experiencing. I also want to thank Kai, the Center for Academic Innovation, for the invitation to be a part of this festival. Mamadou Salah, you do fantastic work in that initiative at DMU, and it's a really important space to have conversations about teaching and learning, not only within the context of the university, but more broadly in the wider world. And so it's been a great opportunity and a great platform to bring some of this work that we're developing in the center as part of that conversation. With that said, if there are no more comments or questions in the chat, I don't know, Natalie, if you wanted to say anything final. I am noticing one other comment here from Monica. Thank you so much for your comments, saying that it was helpful, and please reach out to us. We also, again, this is an area that we're piloting, and so I think my last statement really might be to actually, be, as a call to action to colleagues at DMU to learn a bit more about that. And I think Natalie's idea of raising a kind of sandpit opportunity to bring colleagues together across the university, particularly to think about the impact of COVID-19 within the educational realm, is really, really something important that I think as a university we can, be a part of and help to bring some of those conversations together. So thank you very much for that and bringing together those voices within the wider community around that. That's definitely something that we're interested in terms of the ways that we approach this. So this is sort of stage one, and we're sort of asking questions and trying to get a lay of the land, but it is something that we would like to extend and scale up in different ways. But with that, Natalie, I'll turn to you just to have the last word.
Yeah, just to say that feel free to email us, and if you would like to get involved with any of the research we're doing, but also to perhaps talk about that Sandpit event and do wider things across the university, then we're here. Feel free to email us as well. And again, like Kaneta said, it's just one part of all the great research that's happening in the centre. So there's lots of different activities connected to this indirectly in a way that's trying to tackle some of the issues raised. So do feel free to get in touch, and thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to talk about our research in this platform. So thank you very much.
Thank you.